Next to give a talk on UX design for game dev is Wargaming's Paulina Morrison. Woo!
Hi, welcome everyone. Yes, I'm here to talk about user experience and how we can use that to make better products and better games. So just a bit about me. I'm a project manager here at Wargaming Sydney. I am from Argentina, where I used to be a product manager. And my passion really is to build amazing products that look and feel really good and that make for the best experience with our users. So I'm not a UX researcher or an expert. Please be kind with your questions at the end. But what I'm trying to do here is to communicate what are the tools and what are the resources that we have out there to really build better quality products. My talk today will be focusing on this book. I really encourage everyone to read it. It's like an amazing cheat sheet of everything you need to know related to user experience in building game development tools, but all the content in there really applies to absolutely any product or game that you're building. A bit of the agenda today. So I will be giving an introduction to user experience and then talking about how we can actually make it work within our development environment. So I'll be talking about the user-centered process. Cool. So why do we even care about all of this, right? Here at Wargaming Sydney, we build a technology that is then used by all the other studios across the world to make games. And one thing that we come across a lot is just we make the tools here, and then the artists out there in Minsk and St. Petersburg and Seattle will use our tools. And then when we get the chance to hop on a plane, go over there and speak with those artists, we will just become so horrified by the amount of workarounds and 1,000 clicks that they need to do to try and get one asset exported. And we're like, oh my God, you've been doing this all this time and we didn't really know about it. What's going on? What's wrong with this whole thing? So we really need to go back and revisit our products to try and make them better. So user experience is about trying to fit that loop into trying to make these products better from the start. And then again, we invest so much time in building all these tools that are then used by the artists that we really want to raise the quality bar on them. If artists become frustrated because the tools just won't let them do their job, then they will just really chuck them out and use better tools instead. So we really want to put all this effort into something that will be used to generate loads of games. And the same thing goes for any other game that you build out there. Right? This is a really good way of raising the quality bar on the game, so players will love it. Okay, so let's give a brief introduction into what user experience is. A really good definition is that a tool or a product that you build has to be useful, usable, and desirable. And these three aspects, and there are even more aspects out there, but we're just trying to simplify things a bit. This is what comprises the user experience of a product that you're building. I think most everyone here would have known about the Maslow's pyramid of hierarchy. And what it says is that at a very basic human need, we all need to fulfill our physiological needs. So if you're hungry, then you just really want to eat. And you won't even think about everything else in that pyramid level, especially me. I just need to eat and get it done with. And then once you've got your physiological needs fulfilled, you can move up towards that tip of the pyramid and think about self-actualization and career and improvements. So in a similar way, the UX pyramid is represented in this way, where at a very basic level, your product has to be useful. So it has to fulfill a need. It has to get you from point A to point B. So at a very basic level, it has to be functional. Only once it is functional, we can start improving on it. And this is where we move on to the realm of usability. So usability is really about making that function work better, be more usable, be easier to learn. It's just raising the quality bar on that basic function that you already achieved. So please consider this in the future. You can't really think about user experience if your game doesn't perform its basic functions first. So this is something that you look at when you're trying to improve the quality and make for a better experience. And then in particular, what we will be focusing on today is two aspects of usability. There's generally 5 or 6 different aspects, but for the sake of simplicity and focus, we'll just be looking at efficiency and learnability. I'll talk about this later. So then once you've focused on usability and improving the quality, then you would look at making it desirable. And the reason you would want to make something look desirable is because that also inspires confidence. So if something looks really broken and nasty, chances are you won't trust it to do the job well. But if something looks shiny and amazing and you really enjoy using it, then you will naturally tend to trust it more and choose it again and again and over again to do the job. And in the case of a game, you would want to play it more. So as I said before, we will be focusing the rest of the slides on improving two aspects of usability, which are usually the best ones to target when you start thinking about user experience, and that's efficiency and learnability. Okay, and in order to understand whether we're actually improving things or not, we need to measure. And when we're measuring for efficiency, when we think about efficiency, we're just trying to make it so that a user can achieve their task in a faster way. Because we're talking about game development tools, what we want is for an artist that is trying to achieve a goal with that tool to be able to achieve that faster. And the way we would measure that improvement is just by timing the task. So we'd grab a clock watch or an automated app, and we'd get the user to perform a task. At the beginning, we'd measure it, then we would run our design process, and then at the end, we'd measure that again and compare. And ideally, we've made it more efficient if we've shortened that time. And for learnability, in a very similar and very basic way, what we're aiming at is for a new user to be able to perform a task for the first time in a faster way, and also for a new user to become a master or an expert in that tool in a faster way too. So we would also measure time in this case. Okay, so now that we have a broad understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about user experience, and we've talked about focusing on two aspects of usability, efficiency and learnability. What I'll talk about next is how we can actually make this happen within our game development lifecycle or within our tools development lifecycle. And that's called the user-centered design process. The way this process works is it would fit right into our just software development lifecycle. And you would work, most of you, I assume, as you're building games and you're building products, you've got a product backlog, which is a set of tasks or features that you work your way towards. So in a similar way, you would have a design backlog of just improvements that you want to do to your tool and the goals for each of those improvements. So this is a way of getting through that backlog of improvements, at which point you would have a better tool, a more usable tool. And the core thing of this thing is that the user is at the center of this process. So it's an iterative cycle where we try and involve our users as much as we can. Yeah, we're designing with the user and not for the user. That's a change in paradigm. And it does involve speaking with our players, speaking with our users, reaching out, having face-to-face conversations with them. If we start making assumptions for our users, and chances are we are not the actual user of our tool, then we are being unfair to them. We really need to understand who we are designing these things for. So think about who are the people whose job depends on the tool being able to help them. Think of your players. Sometimes you're building a game, and we've definitely been through this, where you are just not the target player. So if you assume things that your player will enjoy, and you just assume, but you don't really know, that you'll end up designing the game either for yourself or for this generic player that is out there. Chances are you won't get it right. So you really need to go out there and identify who your target players are and try and speak with them, try and get into their heads, understand what motivates them. So start off by identifying your target players, and then keep in mind that so we did an exercise recently where we're exploring a new prototype, and we came up with about 7 different types of players, or users in our case, because it's a product. And we can't really design something for 7 different types of players. It's just too broad. It's just a massive scope to begin with. We really need to narrow it down. So you need to prioritize. You need to choose who you will be designing or who you will be optimizing for. So one strategy that you can use, at least for game development tools, is try and pick different types of So try and pick a sample of users from all your different types, but then really try and focus for the ones that use the tool most frequently, or your most frequent players. Try to identify what the target type is, and chances are if you optimize for your most frequent users, then you will get the most gains out of your usability experiments. Okay, so yeah, prioritizing is really important. So going back to your backlog of improvements, try and prioritize in a way that you will have an impact on your most frequent players or users. Okay, and now how do we actually do this? I talked about the user-centered design process, and I'll quickly go through the 3 different stages that this process has. But on a very basic level, what you would do is you would start off in the analysis phase where you are trying to understand your user. You've identified them, you go out, you speak with them, you get to know them. And what you're really trying to get at is, what do they feel? What motivates them? What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve in life? And then how can your game fulfill that, or how can your tool fulfill that for them? So you're really trying to get into their heads so you can build empathy and you can put yourselves into their shoes. So then when you move into the design phase, you're really trying to think within their mental models and their concepts and not your own. You're really trying thinking from their point of view. And that's why we call it the user-centered design process. And then once you get through your design proposal, then that would go into development, and your development team would implement the changes. And then once those changes are implemented, you would test them out there, and you would see whether you've actually made the improvement that you wanted. So then the way that this would work in a regular sprint, you'd have your development team, and you would have either your UX researcher or your designer. And the sprint before, the current one, they would have done the analysis and the design phases. So then when a new sprint starts, they would have a proposed design that they want the developers to try, and then the developers would make the changes to the code. And then once that is done, they would go out and test it out there and see whether it's actually made the improvement. And if it hasn't, then they go back to the analysis phase and reiterate on that. If it has, then cool, we'll move on to the next optimization in our backlog. And that's the way that would look like in our development lifecycle. So I'll go through a little bit of each of these stages so you get a better idea. The analysis phase, as I said before, it's all really about getting to your user's head, right? And we use something called the human-computer interaction model that basically states that the human mental model is very similar to that of a computer in that you receive your input through what you see from the screen, and then you think about it, you're processing it, and you decide what to do, and then you click on the mouse, which is your act phase. And what we say is that your act phase, where you're actually clicking the mouse, is the only phase in there that actually generates an output and generates something productive. So if you've heard about, well, I'll talk about that later. So one other thing to consider is that thinking about something and trying to understand it has more mental load for a person than interpreting something through your eyes, and then the visual phase has way more cognitive load than the motor phase. So when a person is thinking about something, that requires more effort than acting. And this brings me to my next slide. If you've heard about this, Don't Make Me Think, this is a really well-known book on user experience. And what the author is trying to explain is if you've got a pie chart with basically the distribution of time that a user or a player spends doing something, they've got a portion of time spent thinking, portion of time spent looking at the screen, and then a time acting. If you're trying to aim for efficiency and efficacy, what you want is to optimize towards the acting phase. So the less a person is spent thinking, the more they're spent acting and actually doing stuff, getting shit done. So one of the things that he says is more clicks is not always bad. Sometimes a few extra clicks will reduce the amount of thinking that the user has to do. So consider these things when you're implementing improvements to your design. The book that I'm quoting, the UX, has a lot of really good examples on how to optimize UIs around this, so I really suggest that you read it. Okay, and then how can we use the human-computer interaction model for learnability? So learnability is what I mentioned before. How quickly can a user perform a task for the first time, or can a new user perform a task for the first time, but also how quickly can a user master the tool. So what we really want is for that user to become an expert as fast as possible. And if we're thinking game development, we really want to ramp up those content designers really quickly. And for a player, we want We don't always want them to get through things really quickly. We want them to enjoy the experience, but in a way, we do want them to master the game at a really good pace. So a beginner will spend a lot of time in their thinking phase. They're trying to learn, they're trying to interpret how this thing works. They spend a lot of time on their thinking phase, so you really want to optimize your UI around getting them to learn those simple mechanics really quickly and optimize towards the acting phase. And then as you move along with them in their journey to becoming an expert, you will start adjusting your interface to accompany them in that journey. And then at the very end, once they've become experts, you will really focus on getting the act phase really optimized. So this is where we start thinking about maybe removing elements of the visual interface and just getting power users to use keyboard shortcuts, because that's way quicker. So at the end of the day, what you want is to walk that user along their journey on mastering either the game or the user interface. And Thomas, you mentioned that you apologized for UX and machine learning, but honestly, I really think machine learning could be amazing for this, because you would just be tailoring the onboarding experience for each of the users. Rather than have to decide for a subset of users or a set users, you could just tailor it exclusively, and that would be amazing. You don't even have to do all of this work. So another interesting thing for understanding our users is called mental models. And what you're trying to do here is trying to understand how the user knows something that works in real life. And if you have to build an interface, as much as possible, you want to replicate those mental models that the user already has. So Photoshop does this in a really good way for the brushes settings. I'm an artist. I love to paint. I know intrinsically instinctively what brushes I need for what function. And then when I started using Photoshop, they just replicate that exactly in the user interface. And that basically means that I didn't have to learn that interface. And it's got hundreds of different settings that I didn't even have to learn, because it's really intuitive. It replicates my mental model of what a brush is immediately. There are different techniques. I won't go into detail, suggest you read the book, but basically interviewing stakeholders, that is the single most important thing you could do to understand your users. Identify who are your key players and try and get to know them better. Contextual analysis when you're doing tools is really important. It's about watching your players or your users interact with your interface within their normal context. So you just go over to where they're working, sit down next to them and get them to perform a task, and you just watch them do it. There are studies that say that people will say they do something, but they will actually do something different. So watching them do things is way more important than getting them to tell you about it. Task flows, something that you can use to optimize individual tasks when you're trying to achieve a goal. Mental models, we talked about. Measuring improvements, we talked about. Okay. And then once you understand, or you've got a lot of research for your different player types, then it's really useful to build personas, because this is a really good way to communicate to the rest of your team who you are designing for. So I was talking before about how we identified 7 different types of players. And that was really useful because it also allowed us to understand just how broad that would be if we had to design this product for all these different people. So what we did is we ranked them in priority, and we just decided to target one. And then we've exclusively left out all the other ones. We said we won't target for these other types. And that was really easy to do because we did this exercise. Okay, so the next phase, once we understand our users, we understand their goals and how we need to optimize things for them, would become the design phase. I'm not going to go deep into this because this is graphic designers are all over this, and UI designers. So this is your traditional design iteration. What I would suggest is, as much as possible, follow existing patterns. Don't reinvent the wheel. Patterns have been tested, and there's really big companies that have invested in solidifying them. Users already know them. So if you decide to reinvent any of these, then you're just adding that cognitive load on the user. You don't really want that. So as much as possible, look at what Microsoft, Apple, Adobe, what open standards have done, and you'll be okay. And then if you do come across a new type of challenge, then sure, there you can innovate, or you could look at other similar tools and see what they're already doing there. These are techniques, design techniques. Any graphic designer would know these. You could definitely explore these a bit more. They are all about structuring information so that you get the user to focus on one thing first. And all of these have very specific impact on learnability and efficiency. I was talking to someone before about tailoring the UI for the different levels of players. You can look into progressive disclosure. It's really interesting stuff. I won't go into detail because it would take me another hour. But the idea is your designer will use these techniques to target that goal that you're after. And then once there is a proposed design, you would hand that either over to the developers, or you might decide to just sketch it, pen and paper. You don't really need to do the code if you don't need to. Sometimes a mock-up will be way cheaper. And it's also a really good way to test learnability because you can iterate quickly. You can get feedback on something that is not clear, and you can just go back to your pen and paper and draw something else and test it again. Whereas if you are trying to measure efficiency, then you do really want to code it into your game or your product. Definitely. Cool. And then another thing that I really do suggest you do, if you really don't have the resources to go out there and speak with players and interact with them, and you have no other choice, so one good way of thinking about the usability of your game or your product is to run a test plan of heuristics. So there's a list of already known heuristics that if you comply with this, the usability of your game will be better. So what I would suggest is at a very minimum, run these. As an example, first one, the visibility of system status. Does the user know at all times what the tool is doing? If the user doesn't know, then they will think that the tool has crashed, and then they will close it and start it again. So they need a way of knowing what the tool is doing or what the game is doing at all times. So we use feedback there. And then, so user control and freedom. Can they go back to where they were before? Are you giving them an option to undo or to redo? Are you giving them enough freedom to move around and not feel constrained? But also error prevention. Are you trying to avoid the user from making mistakes? So just as a very quick exercise, we've got the interface for the NVIDIA normal map filter. And so the first heuristic that we'd run is the aesthetic and minimal design okay? How would a beginner user deal with this interface? And chances are they would have a lot of trouble. There's just so many options in there. So we're definitely overwhelming them from the beginning. This might be okay for an expert user, not for a beginner. So declutter this a bit. Then second one, consistency and standards. If we look at these radio buttons here, there's way more than 7 options, and Microsoft standards state that if you've got more than 7 options, then use a Dropbox, because around seven threads is about as much focus as the user can have. So if you need to go through all of those choices, you're better off with a drop-down. And that's just a standard. That's just the way it's done. So, just follow the standard, basic. And then the last one, error prevention. So we've got a checkbox here to use a decal texture, but you haven't really chosen the decal texture yet. So chances are if you click that, you'll get an error. So maybe just disable that checkbox until the user has selected a texture. Just don't let them do things that would result in an error. So this is a very basic example, just a few set of things you could implement to improve the usability of your games straight away. And then the most important one, but the one that is the most expensive to do, is to do user tests. So you have to plan for these. You need to have a test plan, select your users, prepare the environment, get them to test it. This is the one where you get the most gains out of, but it's also most expensive to run. Good thing is with games, players are always really keen to participate in these things. So that's a really good bonus. Okay, and then once you've gone through your evaluation and seen whether you actually did a good improvement, then you go back to the analysis phase and you either move on to your next item in the backlog to optimize, or you iterate on the same one. And that's it. So we've covered a brief definition of what user experience is. So it's not really about doing the graphic design or the UI. It's about improving the quality of your product and tailoring the experience to your users. We talked about what usability is, and in particular, we focused on efficiency and learnability. You could also focus on other aspects like memorability or management satisfaction. If you look online for usability, you'll get more quality factors in there. We also talked about how to design with the user in mind. and how to iterate, involving the user into our different phases. And then, yeah, so try it at home. First thing you could do, again, do a heuristic evaluation, start with the very basics, and also try and sit down with some of your players or users and try and understand where they're coming from and what motivates them. And read these books. Okay, thank you.